After the Rebellion of 1837, Upper and Lower Canada were left unorganized and still shaken from the battles that had ravaged the colonies. Supporters of William Lyon Mackenzie found themselves without a cause and unsure of how to adapt to the new changes the land had faced. While some accepted the changes that the Victorian era brought about, others went the opposite direction, turning to crime for their money. It wasn't until 1845, however, that people realized that these crimes were not all random, but in fact involved the work of a skilled criminal organization located in Upper Canada that was later dubbed the Markham Gang. Unlike what one usually associates with criminals, the Markham Gang was made up of well-to-do landowners and many influential families, who originated mostly from areas north and northeast of Toronto. The gang's activities were extensive, from petty theft to forgery to murder. The Markham Gang had many members, but some of the most notable members are as follows. The Badgerows were a wealthy family who arrived from New York and settled east of Toronto. They were the founding members of the First Markham Baptist Church and supporters of William Lyon Mackenzie. David Morden and his wife, Lydia White, were strong supporters of William Lyon Mackenzie during the Rebellion of 1837 and later members of the Markham Gang. Matthew Udall came from a highly respected family of war heroes. He married Mary Hamilton, but the witness to this marriage was a Markham Gang member, and he soon joined the gang. Ira White married Elizabeth Breezor with his good friend Truman Pennock as his witness. Later, Ira and Elizabeth named their son Truman Pennock White in honor of their friend. Both Truman Pennock and Truman Pennock White were members of the Markham Gang. There were 3 men named Henry Johnson in the Markham Gang, all proficient horse stealers. Lucas Stutenberg married a woman named Elizabeth Case. Together they had 13 children, many of which joined the Markham Gang. However, the Stutenbergs managed to keep a good name in the law for themselves, as they helped officials arrest and charge many other Markham Gang members who were not their children. Reuben Crandall married Catherine Moore, and of their 12 children, Stephen Elmore, Benjamin, George, Lucianne, and Eleanor were members of the Markham Gang. Reuben was also part of the gang, but was always very careful not to be caught. This gang of its unlikely members had mastered the art of petty theft. They kept no stolen goods at their homes, so methods like search warrants did not stop them. They also transported valuable items to Canada East and the southern Quebec area, where they would exchange goods for counterfeit money, which they would then distribute to lower-ranking members of the gang. Another one of the Markham Gang's major activities were horse and cattle stealing. This was a complicated process perfected to avoid capture. 2 members would steal 2 horses at 2 different locations. They would meet and then switch horses and ride. Sometimes, gang members would pretend to be officials, accuse farmers of possessing stolen goods, and then pretend to confiscate these goods, only to sell them later. Unfortunately, at the time, there was not an efficient form of policing. The minimal amount of police outside Toronto and Kingston were either in cahoots with the Markham Gang or had been threatened off. Even in Toronto, there was a lack of police. Newspapers like the British Colonist demanded for night police due to the amount of crimes. The newspaper even went so far as to call this lack of protection criminal neglect on the part of the authorities. There were also a lack of crime records in this time, which allowed the Markham Gang to conveniently hide their patterns. So how was it that this notorious gang was apprehended? Chief Justice John Beverly Robinson and newspaper reports paint it like this. John Morrow and his wife, Mary Morrow, lived with their 3 children on a lot of land northeast of Toronto. That night, November 7th, 1845, was cold, with freezing temperatures and harsh winds. That night, John had decided to go to bed early at around 7 o'clock. The children were also in bed, but Mary continued to work around the house. Several hours later, at around midnight, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps. The door smashed open and in burst 4 men. Mary was struck in the face and knocked to the ground. At this point, John had risen and was running forward to protect his wife. But one of the gang members swung at John with a club and began to beat him savagely, yelling at him to hand over his money. A gang member put a gun to Mary's head and demanded that she hand them their money. Finally, Mary gave the men her purse and they took it, ripping it open. One of the men struck John again, and Mary moved to cover him with her body, trying to protect him from their assailant, as John had been knocked cool. At this time, Mary was begging for mercy and crying, but the men hit her and John again, and finally left. When Mary dragged herself to the doorway and looked out, she saw that there were at least 10 men now leaving, heading in groups in different directions. When she returned to the body of her husband, she was relieved to find that his heart was still beating, though faintly. For several hours, she tended to him. And finally, at dawn, he regained consciousness. That morning, John went to the closest magistrate to report the incident. He was sure that 3 of the men who had attacked him were his neighbors, Nathan Case, Hiram Stutenborough, and his brother, James Stutenborough. Therefore, on November 12th, the men were arrested, but they were later released on bail. George Garnett, the alderman of Toronto and clerk of the peace for the Home District, a powerful member of the family compact, arrested. Casper Stotts, who gave up his fellow members and thus led to the arrest of many other members of the Markham Gang. In the Markham Gang's trial, William Hume Blake, the leader of the Reform Party and foe of the family compact, came to the defense of the Markham Gang, saying that the case was politically motivated and George Garnett was getting revenge on the supporters of William Lyon Mackenzie. However, Robert Byrne, Nathan Case, and Hiram and James Stutenborough were sentenced to death, and another 11 members received jail time between 8 months and 7 years. Later, though, the Attorney General of Upper Canada changed the death penalties into prison sentences. Unfortunately, this was not the last of the Markham Gang. On November 12, 1846, William McPhillips, manager of Logan's General Store in Markham, was found dead after beaten with a hammer earlier that night. George Garnett traveled to Markham and questioned everyone about possible ties to the Markham Gang, but nothing arose from it. However, several people reported seeing gang member Stephen Turney in Toronto with jewelry and clothing. When asked where he'd got it, he couldn't explain, so he was arrested. The court convicted him and he was hanged on June 23, 1847. The case was captured by newspaper The British Colonist, and they published a story called An Account of the Markham Gang, which gave the gang their name. The hanging was the final end of the gang. Other members left jail, but they stopped their criminal ways, claiming they had lost too much money. After hearing the fascinating story of the Markham Gang, one must question why this is such an unknown story. Why were the members released after such short sentences? Why are the names of some of the members not on lists of criminals? And why are these events not included in textbooks? Even records of the trials of the members have been destroyed. This is because these events are part of a dark and lawless period of Canada's history, and at this time, most of Canadian historians had the idea of keeping the government painted in a positive light. The leaders of Canada's lack of justice around the members of the Markham Gang was likely too much of a convoluted subject that did not fall into the black and white portrayal of good and evil in Canada. Historians writing about this period of Canada tend to focus on the rebels and the family compact and Chateau clique. There is little written about the era's social problems and incompetent government. However, though the story of the Markham Gang is often unclear, what we know shows the great determination of the people of Canada and the many odds they faced, only to overcome them and build the great nation which we live in today.